Well, we were engaged. I had the ring. I think, but you know, nobody knows who he is anymore, Janet.
No.
No. I think about a year and a half, yeah.
At 92, Joan Collins has seen it all: fame, heartbreak, passion, and long-lasting success. She has loved powerful men, lived through public marriages, and finally built a life many people only dream of. But even with all that, there was still one man she never got over. For years, she kept his name hidden, locked away in her past. The love they shared was deeper, more personal, and harder to move on from. This was someone different, someone who left a mark that time could not erase. As she looked back on her long life, those memories still stood strong above the rest. So who was this man? And why did he stay in her heart for so many years? Join us as we find out about the lover Joan could never replace, the one she never got over. For decades, Joan Collins kept certain parts of her story very close to her chest. She was always willing to talk about her career, her timeless style, her strong views on aging. She would discuss her marriages openly and without apology, even the painful ones. But there was one corner of her past that she handled with careful restraint. It was not silence exactly. It was something more controlled, the way a person speaks about a subject they have decided to manage rather than explore. When the name came up, she would answer the question and then move on quickly, as if lingering too long might reveal something she was not yet ready to share with the world. That name was Warren Beatty. And it was only at the age of 90 that Joan finally said clearly and openly that he was the one man she had never truly got over. Joan and Beatty first met in 1959 at an upscale restaurant in Los Angeles. She was still quite young and in her prime. In her autobiography, Passion for Life, Collins described being charmed by his good looks, but not speaking to him that night. The following week, Beatty tracked down her phone number through a Hollywood contact and called to ask her out on a date. It was a beginning that felt almost ordinary, which made what followed all the more complicated. There was no thunderbolt, no instant declaration of passion. What there was, however, was a pull. In her autobiography, Collins wrote that Beatty was 22 and insanely ambitious. He soon moved into her apartment, and the two found themselves very compatible in ways that surprised even Joan. They cooked together, argued about film scripts, and moved through the social world of early 1960s Hollywood side by side. Joan was already an established actress, while Warren was still building his reputation. There was an electricity between them that she found difficult to explain and impossible to dismiss. It was not the sweeping love she had imagined as a girl in London, but it was real, and it was hers, and for a while it felt like more than enough. Beatty proposed to Joan in 1960, hiding the engagement ring inside a container of chopped liver, her favorite dish. The gesture was both affectionate and unusual, very much in keeping with the man who did it. Joan accepted, and for a time the engagement was the talk of Hollywood. People who saw them together assumed this was the relationship that would finally hold. Joan wanted to believe it too. She wore the ring, let the press capture her with it, and let herself imagine a version of the future that included Warren Beatty as a permanent presence in her life. This very relationship was the closest she had come to real romantic hope since her disastrous first marriage. But unfortunately, Beatty's faithfulness was a constant question mark. Rumors circulated consistently about his involvement with other women, including some of the biggest names in the industry. Although Joan heard these stories and felt the weight of them, she stayed in the relationship and tried her best to ignore what her instincts were clearly telling her. She gave him the benefit of the doubt longer than most women would have. That itself said something significant about how much she cared. When the evidence finally became too great to ignore, she did not explode or fall apart in public. She made her decision in silence, with the composure of a woman who has already processed something painful long before she acts on it. Eventually, their relationship ended in 1961. Beatty later referred to the engagement dismissively, calling it an exaggeration. That word landed differently for Joan than it might have for anyone else. For him, perhaps, it had been less significant than it appeared. For her, it had been the most honest and complete thing she had offered any man up to that point in her life. Joan later wrote in Passion for Life that marriage to Warren would never have lasted because he simply loved the ladies too much. It was a clear-eyed assessment, delivered without drama or visible self-pity. But underneath the composure was a truth she spent the next 6 decades gradually circling, that none of the men who came after Beatty ever quite occupied the same specific place in her heart. Even in her most recent autobiography, Behind the Shoulder Pads, published when Joan was 90, she returned to Beatty once more. She wrote about running into him years later at a Hollywood screening, describing him as full of charm. Surprisingly, he told her husband Percy that he still loved her. Percy responded with playful wit, and Joan noted with dry humor that since it was Hollywood, where conversation is rarely followed by action, she doubted any reunion dinner would ever actually take place. There was lightness in the telling, but beneath it was something more tender and more honest. A woman at 90, happily married, still writing about a man from 60 years earlier with enough warmth to fill a page. At 92, that warmth had not gone anywhere at all. Why he was different? There have been many glamorous women in Hollywood, but very few who have loved as publicly and as honestly as Joan Collins. She never pretended her relationships were something they were not. She wrote about them in detail, talked about them in interviews, and revisited them across multiple memoirs over many decades. Through all of that honesty, one relationship always came out differently in the telling. Warren Beatty was not just another chapter in Joan's story. He was the chapter she kept coming back to, the one she had never quite finished writing in her own heart. Collins and Beatty began dating after they crossed paths at a restaurant in Los Angeles in 1959. She was 26, and he was 22. In her autobiography, Passion for Life, Collins wrote that although she was not madly in love with Warren, the two were actually very compatible. That combination, genuine compatibility without the blinding rush of new infatuation, is rarer and often far more durable than people realize. Joan had been in relationships before Beatty that were driven by overwhelming emotion or difficult circumstances. What she found with him was something more grounded, a real and quiet understanding of each other that did not depend on perfect conditions or manufactured romance. Beatty was described by Collins in her writing as 22 and insanely ambitious. She found him extremely endearing in a boyish way that she did not entirely expect. He was not yet the Hollywood legend he would eventually become when she met him. When Joan found him, Warren Beatty was still figuring out his exact place in the world. He was sharp, competitive, and restless, in a way that was both attractive and slightly dangerous to be around. Joan, who was already a recognized actress by then, occupied a different position in the industry. She was more experienced, more settled in herself as a professional. But she responded to his hunger and his drive. She recognized something in his ambition that genuinely matched her own deep sense of purpose. There was a revealing moment early in the relationship that said a great deal about who Beatty was and why Joan found him so compelling. When they first met, he had told Joan he was 21. She only discovered his real age of 22 when she happened to spot his driver's license lying on a table. When she confronted him, he admitted he had knocked a year off because he felt the competition in Hollywood was so fierce. In his mind, being younger might give him a slight edge. It was a small deception, and Joan found it far more endearing than alarming. It revealed the genuine anxiety of a young man who was not yet entirely sure of his standing. Joan, who had been performing since the age of 9 and had navigated Hollywood's brutal politics since her early 20s, understood that anxiety completely. What also made Beatty genuinely different was the way he influenced her thinking, even when that influence worked against her own best interests. In 1960, Joan was offered a role in the British film Sons and Lovers, an adaptation of D.H. Lawrence's celebrated novel. She wanted to take it. Her instincts told her it was good work. But Beatty told her the script was worthless, and Joan, who at that time was more influenced by the men in her life than she later wished she had been, turned it down. The role went to actress Mary Ure, who was subsequently nominated for an Academy Award. Joan later described this as her one genuine regret in all of her decades in Hollywood. She gave up an Oscar-nominated role because one man's opinion had temporarily outweighed her own. The fact that Beatty's influence reached that far into her professional decision-making says everything about the nature of their connection. Joan Collins was not a woman who gave up control easily. She was fiercely independent by nature and had fought hard for everything she had built. For her to surrender her own judgment on a career decision, even briefly, required a level of trust and emotional investment that she simply had not extended to other people in the same way. Beatty had reached that deeply into her thinking, and Joan was honest enough to acknowledge it plainly, even decades after the relationship had ended. In 1960, during the engagement, Joan discovered she was pregnant. Both she and Beatty believed that having a child together while unmarried would cause serious damage to both of their careers, and the pregnancy was terminated. Joan reflected on this decision in later years with honesty, noting that in hindsight she understood the reasoning. Without that choice, she would not have gone on to have her 3 children with later husbands. But it was still a profound and defining moment. 2 people standing at the very edge of something permanent, choosing together to step back from it. That kind of shared decision, made under difficult circumstances, creates a bond that time does not simply dissolve. It stays in the body, in the memory, in the particular silence a person keeps around one particular name. Defined by love and loss. Joan Henrietta Collins was born on May 23, 1933 in Paddington, London. She grew up in Maida Vale, the daughter of Elsa Collins, a dance teacher, and Joseph William Collins, a talent agent whose clients would later include Tom Jones and the Beatles. It was a household soaked in the world of entertainment, and Joan absorbed every bit of it from a very young age. She grew up watching glamour, ambition, and performance all around her. That environment shaped a girl who wanted nothing less than to stand at the very center of it all. From the beginning, the stage was not just a dream, it was a destination. She made her stage debut at the age of 9 in Henrik Ibsen's play A Doll's House, and at 16 she began training at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London. She was a teenager in a city still carrying the scars of the Second World War, but her mind was already set on a world far beyond the rubble. She made her British film debut in 1952, and the audience loved her. She had a face that stopped people mid-sentence, a mix of fire and softness that was impossible to ignore. Hollywood noticed, and Joan stepped into its bright light without looking back or flinching for even a moment. She landed her first film role as an uncredited beauty pageant contestant in the 1951 movie Lady Godiva Rides Again. From there, the roles kept coming. She played a femme fatale in Howard Hawks's epic Land of the Pharaohs in 1955. Joan's screen presence was impossible to dismiss. She was bold, magnetic, and completely relaxed in front of a camera. Hollywood signed her and put her in one film after another. The roles were not always great, but Joan made them shine. She drove a pink Thunderbird through the streets of Los Angeles like she owned the entire city. Through all the studio meetings and film sets, Joan was also navigating a personal life that read more like a dramatic script than anything Hollywood could dream up. She had been through a deeply traumatic first marriage before most women her age had even figured out who they were. She later claimed that her first husband, actor Maxwell Reed, had spiked her drink and took advantage of her on their very first date, and that she married him out of shame when she was still just a teenager. She was 19 years old and already carrying wounds that no amount of apology could heal. Yet she kept moving. Her career climbed steadily through the 1950s and 1960s, but it was her personal life that kept the public absolutely fixated. She dated some of the most recognizable names in the entire entertainment industry. Her high-profile romances included James Dean, Hotel heir Nikki Hilton, Ryan O'Neal, Harry Belafonte, and her former fiancé, Warren Beatty. These were not private romances. They played out under the full glare of Hollywood. Joan was a woman who drew extraordinary attention simply by existing, and the world had absolutely no intention of looking away. By the early 1970s, Joan found herself appearing in films that were well below her ability. Her career had dipped, and some in Hollywood had written her off. But Joan refused to disappear. She made a shocking comeback with The Stud and the Bitch, two wildly popular films adapted from novels written by her sister, Jackie Collins. The films were bold, provocative, and widely successful. Joan had reinvented herself in public, on screen, and in the eyes of an industry that had nearly forgotten just how magnetic she really was. She was not the type to fade quietly into the background. She was built to come back stronger. Then came Dynasty. The role of the scheming, glamorous Alexis Carrington Colby was initially offered to Sophia Loren, who turned it down. It was then passed to Collins, who at the time had appeared primarily in B-films and minor television productions. Joan took the role and transformed it into something genuinely unforgettable. Alexis was ruthless, witty, and completely compelling. Audiences around the world tuned in every week just to see what she would do next. The show became a global phenomenon, and Joan Collins became a name that echoed from London to Los Angeles. Behind the fame and the shoulder pads, however, there was a woman who had loved deeply and lost painfully more times than anyone should. 5 marriages, countless heartbreaks, and a lifetime of very hard lessons learned in very public ways. Joan had given pieces of herself to men who were not always worthy of what she so generously offered. She had survived maltreatment, betrayal, financial ruin, and public humiliation. Through all of it, she carried herself with her chin up and her posture straight. That was the most remarkable thing about Joan Collins. But somewhere deep inside, one chapter had never truly closed. Journey of the Heart. By the time Joan Collins reached her 30s, she had already lived more in love than most people manage in an entire lifetime. Her first marriage set the tone in the most painful way imaginable. She explained that she ended up marrying him out of shame at the age of 19. Over the course of their 4-year marriage, she endured ongoing mistreatment. The final and most humiliating episode came when Reed allegedly attempted to sell her for the night to a wealthy Arab sheikh at a nightclub in Mayfair. Joan walked out and never looked back. By the end of the marriage, she had a brutally clear picture of what she deserved. After leaving Reed, Joan entered what she later described as a more irregular chapter of her romantic life. She became, by her own admission, a serial monogamist, living with several partners in arrangements that were considered unusual for a woman of her era. She lived for a time with Sidney Chaplin, the son of the legendary Charlie Chaplin. She had a meaningful relationship with Arthur Lowe Jr., the grandson of one of the co-founders of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. These were exciting partnerships that kept Joan at the center of Hollywood's social circles. But nothing lasted. Something was always quietly missing. It was during these years of searching that Joan crossed paths with a young, largely unknown actor at a restaurant in Los Angeles. She was 26 and he was 22. His name was Warren Beatty. Their meeting would become one of the most discussed romances in Hollywood history, not because it produced a fairy tale ending, but precisely because it did not. Beatty was everything Joan had not encountered before. Young, hungry, brilliantly sharp, and full of an energy that was almost exhausting to be around. He had plans, ambitions, and a confidence that filled every room he entered. They began dating in 1959, and by 1960 they were engaged. The proposal itself was the kind of story only Hollywood could produce. Beatty hid the engagement ring, a cultured pearl and diamond piece set in a textured gold mount, inside a container of Joan's favorite dish, chopped liver. It was playful, personal, and unexpectedly sweet, revealing a side of Beatty that the wider public rarely got to see. Joan was charmed. It seemed as though the two most dazzling young people in Hollywood had genuinely found each other. But charm is not always the same as faithfulness, and Beatty had a very complicated relationship with both. After Beatty, Joan's romantic life continued on its course without slowing down. She began dating singer-songwriter Anthony Newley and married him in 1963. They had 2 children together, Tara and Alexander, but the marriage collapsed in 1971 due to Newley's persistent womanizing. He was a celebrated talent, but he could not keep himself faithful to one woman. And Joan, who placed much value on loyalty above almost everything else, eventually reached her absolute limit. She had her own brief affair with British actor Terence Stamp in response, but she later admitted honestly that it was already far too late to save the marriage. In 1972, Joan married Ron Cass, a music executive who had previously served as the head of the Beatles' record label Apple. Their early years together were genuinely happy. Joan later wrote that the first 3 years of the marriage were among the happiest of her entire life. They had a daughter, Katiana, and Joan felt something close to real stability for the first time in many years. But Cass lost his job, fell into serious financial difficulty, and then into substance addiction. Joan was left nearly penniless, and their marriage dissolved steadily. Again, Joan found herself picking up the pieces of a love she had genuinely believed in. Her 4th marriage, to Swedish singer Peter Holm in 1985, was perhaps the most chaotic and damaging of all. Collins later said that Holm was physically aggressive, and she obtained a restraining order against him before the marriage completely collapsed. The union lasted less than 2 years, ending in 1987, and Joan told anyone who would listen that she would never walk down the aisle again. She had been through enough. She had offered herself honestly, openly, and repeatedly to men who took what she gave and then broke something in the process. The void that none of them could fill was still there. Quiet, persistent, and patient. It had been there since 1961, when a young man with insatiable ambition finally walked out of her life for good. The regret and the courage to finally speak. There is something that happens to people when they reach the far end of a long and fully examined life. The calculations change in ways that are hard to predict. The things that once felt too raw, too private, or too complicated to say out loud begin to feel less dangerous. The armor that a person spends decades building and maintaining starts to come down. not all at once, but piece by piece, quietly and on its own terms. Joan Collins spent most of her life being one of the most talked-about women in the entire world, and she had learned, very early on, the important difference between being talked about and actually being known. She was always willing to perform her life for a waiting audience. It took until she was 90 to begin telling the full, unguarded truth of it. Joan opened up about her personal life in her autobiography, Behind the Shoulder Pads, including detailed and honest accounts of her time with Warren Beatty. The book was written and published when Joan was in her 90s, and it carried a noticeably different quality from her earlier memoirs. There was less performance in it, less carefully managed image and controlled distance. In its place was something more vulnerable and more real. A woman looking back across a very long life and deciding, finally, to say the things she had previously only said in private, or not at all. Beatty appeared in the book not as a villain to be dismissed or a regret to be minimized, but as a genuine and lasting presence. Someone whose memory still occupied a very particular space in her interior life. The courage involved in making that admission publicly should not be underestimated for a single moment. Joan Collins had built her public identity largely on the image of a woman in absolute control of herself and everything around her. She was glamorous, sharp, funny, and entirely unflappable. She was not the kind of woman who pined. She did not do public vulnerability if she could find any way to avoid it. So to name, clearly and without deflection, the one man she had never fully got over. To admit that after 5 marriages and an entire lifetime of love, one relationship from the early 1960s still held a unique and irreplaceable position in her heart, was an act of genuine personal honesty. It was, in its own quiet way, far braver than any of the roles she had ever played on screen. In her autobiography, Joan recounted a moment at a Hollywood screening where she and Beatty came face to face many years after their relationship had ended. He was all charm, as he always had been. He told her husband Percy that he still loved her. Percy responded with a good-natured challenge, and Joan wrote about the exchange with dry wit, noting that since it was Hollywood, where talk tends to be cheap and promises rarely materialized into action, she very much doubted the warmly promised dinner would ever actually happen. The story was told with a light touch, as Joan always handled the most complicated ones. But it revealed something important. The connection between them had not simply evaporated with the passage of time. It had persisted, quietly and stubbornly, across decades and marriages and all the distance that an entire lifetime places between two people. Joan has described her current marriage to Percy Gibson as the best of her life, telling Louis Theroux in a BBC documentary that she had finally found what a truly wonderful marriage felt like. This is a crucial and necessary part of the full picture. Naming Warren Beatty as the one she never got over was absolutely not a confession of unhappiness in the life she had eventually built. It was not a slight against Percy, whom she loves with enormous depth, loyalty, and obvious joy. It was something else entirely, an honest acknowledgement that the human heart is not a simple or tidy instrument. It does not file away old attachments cleanly when instructed to do so. It holds on to certain things for reasons that do not always submit to logic or convenience. Joan was not saying she wished she had made different choices. She was saying, plainly and without drama, that one person had left a mark that no amount of living had entirely erased. Joan described her marriage to Percy as a love rooted in deep friendship, mutual admiration, and a genuine enjoyment of each other's company. Not just as husband and wife, but as two people who truly liked each other. That kind of love, built on respect and real understanding, was what Joan ultimately found after the years of frustration. Percy offered her stability, consistent kindness, and a partnership entirely free of cruelty or betrayal. He was, as she described him on more than one occasion, the most honorable man she had ever known. Yet even within that deep and earned security, the honest part of Joan could not pretend that Beatty had not mattered in a specific and permanent way. Both things were entirely true at once. That is the complicated and very human reality of a long, fully lived life. At 92, Joan Collins is one of the last surviving members of Hollywood's original Golden Age. She has lived through eras that most people only encounter in books or archive footage. She has loved and lost, been broken and rebuilt, walked away from marriages, and finally found the peace she deserved. The fact that she chose, in the final chapter of her remarkable story, to speak plainly and openly about the man who had never fully left her heart was not a moment of weakness. It was the act of a woman who had completely earned the right to say exactly what was true. Warren Beatty got away. Joan had always known it, and in naming it at last, she gave the world something far more valuable than the carefully constructed image she had spent 7 decades perfecting. She gave them the unfiltered, courageous, and deeply human truth. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.